Ba-da-da, welcome back to Kid Activist with Miss Jan. Hey, Miss Jan, how are you?
Hey, Missing. I'm great. I'm learning so much through this series.
Dude, I love this series.
Really
I really like
it.
that book. Can I see the front again? Show everybody the front again.
Mm-hmm.
Kid Activist. And today, who is our activist kid today?
None other than Fredrick Douglass.
Fredrick Douglass, 2 S's.
So you can look here and
There
see.
And we were just saying, like my mom was really into how guys looked. Well, she thought pretty much every man was good looking. But my mom would definitely think that at least these artist renderings of Fredrick Douglass, good looking. Well, but you know what? Yeah. You're all good looking. That's the thing.
Right.
That's right. Yeah. Everybody's good looking just the way they are.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about Mr. Douglass.
Shall we start with the book?
Let's do it.
Fredrick Douglass, A Determination to be Free. Determined means he was really set on making that happen.
Nice.
Fredrick Douglass spent his life fighting to end the enslavement of Black Americans. He believed in equality for all people, and he later supported the right for women to vote. But before he could fight to change the world around him, he first had to escape from bondage and become free. Bondage means that he was kept
chained up or tied
up.
He was enslaved,
right? He was enslaved,
yeah.
Yes. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, that's his whole name, was born around 1818. At that time, more than 1 million African people were enslaved in America, and many white families owned slaves whom they considered to be their property. Hard to imagine, isn't it? Frederick was born into slavery because his mother was enslaved. He never knew his exact birth date. As a child, it made him unhappy that the white children knew their ages, but he was not even allowed to ask about his. As a boy, Frederick lived with his cousins, his younger sisters, and his grandparents. They shared a small cabin on a farm that was part of a huge plantation in Maryland. Frederick had been separated from his mother when he was a baby. Her name was Harriet Bailey, and she was enslaved on another farm 12 miles away. A few times after working in the fields all day, she walked 12 miles through the night to see her son. She'd lie down with him, and once he was asleep, she walked home. If she wasn't back in the field by sunrise, she would be punished by being whipped. Frederick was still young when his mother died, and he never had the chance to know her well. He later wrote, "I do not recollect of ever seeing my mother by the light of day."
Wow.
Yeah, just these nighttime visits. Still, these first few years of Frederick's childhood were happier than those that followed. He loved his grandmother very much. Although she was also enslaved, she was considered too old for labor and instead took care of Frederick and the other children. She did her best to protect Frederick from the full truth about slavery, but sometimes he heard talk of an old master who only allowed children to live with their grandmother for a short time before they would be taken away to live with him. Frederick spent his time exploring in the woods, in the creek, or playing gleesome sports with other children, but he had a growing sense of dread. He later wrote, "Grandmammy was, indeed, at that time, all the world to me, and the thought of being separated from her in any considerable time was more than an unwelcome intruder. It was intolerable." When he was 6 years old, think about that, that dreaded day came. Frederick was sent to live with the old master, a man known as Captain Anthony. It was a long journey which he and his grandmother walked together. When they arrived, Frederick's grandmother told him to go play. Then she quietly left. Devastated, Frederick cried himself to sleep that night. The next day, Frederick was forced to start working. He had to keep the yard clean, bring the cows in at night, and run errands. Although he was only 6, no one took care of him. Get this part is really amazing. He had no shoes, no jacket, no pants. He and the other enslaved children were given only 2 shirts a year. If those shirts wore out, they had nothing to wear. Fredrick and the other children were fed cooked cornmeal, which was called mush. It was poured into a trough on the ground, and they had to eat with their hands or scoop the food with shells or broken shingles. And there was never enough. Fredrick often went hungry. And in the winter, he was freezing. He had no bed, so he stole a bag used for carrying corn and crawled inside, sleeping on the cold, damp floor. When he was 8 years old, Fredrick's life changed again. His owner died and he was given to new owners, Thomas and Lucretia Auld. They sent him to live in Baltimore with Thomas's brother Hugh Auld and his family. In his new home, Fredrick had a room in a loft above the kitchen. Mrs. Auld made him a bed of mattress stuffed with straw. He had a woolen blanket, clothes, and better food to eat. Most important, Mrs. Auld taught Fredrick the alphabet and showed him how to read simple words. When her husband found out, he was furious. If she taught Fredrick how to read, he said, it would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. Well, those words changed Fredrick's course of life. From that moment, he wrote, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. If reading could make him unfit for slavery, then he would learn to read. Fredrick seized every opportunity to look at newspapers and books. The more he read, the more he understood about slavery, and the more he hated those who kept him enslaved. He dreamed of being free, but it seemed impossible. Freedom, he wrote, was ever present to torment me with a sense of my wretched condition. When Fredrick was 15, his life took another turn for the worse. He was sent back to live with his owner. Thomas Auld and his wife were well matched, Fredrick wrote, being equally mean and cruel. Fredrick, who was tall and strong and good with words, argued with Thomas Auld. He was whipped many times, and finally he was rented out to work for a man named Edward Covey, who had a reputation for violence and brutality. Fredrick was forced to till fields from sunup until sundown, and often long into the night. He had to work with draft horses and teams of oxen, and the big animals scared him. But worst of all was the vicious bullying from Edward Covey. Exhausted and in constant pain, Fredrick could see no way out. One day he decided to stand up to Covey. They fought each other for 2 hours before Covey gave up. After that, Covey seemed afraid of Fredrick. He never tried to whip him again. The fight, Fredrick said, was a turning point. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom. It recalled the departed self-confidence and inspired me again with a determination to be free. When Fredrick was about 16, he was sent to work on other farms. He became friends with 2 enslaved young men, Henry and John Harris. Secretly, he began teaching them to read. Other slaves wanted to learn too. So Fredrick began holding classes on Sundays at the home of a free black man. At one time, he had more than 40 students. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Fredrick loved teaching. Later, he wrote, the work of instructing my dear fellow slaves was the sweetest engagement with which I was ever blessed. Fredrick's desire for freedom was growing stronger every day. Trying to escape was dangerous, and those who were caught were severely punished. But Fredrick and his friends decided to take the chance. They made a plan. They would steal a canoe paddle it up the Chesapeake Bay, and then walk, following the North Star, until they reached the Maryland border. Unfortunately, word of their plan got out. They were dragged off to jail, and Fredrick was separated from his friends. He was alone and in despair. I expected to have been safe in the land of freedom, he wrote, but now I was covered with gloom. I thought the possibility of freedom was gone. But Fredrick did not give up. After being released from prison, he was hired out to work in a shipyard where he met many black sailors who were free. He also met a free black woman, Anna Murray, and fell in love with her. When Fredrick was around 20 years old, he borrowed protection papers from a sailor friend. These papers certified that the bearer was a free man, a sailor, not a slave. This was dangerous for both men. Fredrick later described it as an act of supreme trust for a free man to risk his liberty to help another become free. Since the paper said Fredrick was a sailor, Anna altered his clothes to make him look the part. She sold a feather bed to pay for his journey to freedom, and Fredrick caught a train heading north. When the train conductor asked to see the documents that all free black people had to carry, Fredrick said, "I never carry my free papers to sea with me." He handed over his seaman's papers instead. The conductor glanced at them quickly and handed them back. It was fortunate that he didn't look too carefully. The papers described a man who looked nothing like Fredrick. Next, Fredrick caught a ferry across the Susquehanna River to Pennsylvania, where he had another close call. A man he knew saw him and expressed surprise to see him dressed as a sailor. Fredrick dodged the man's questions and moved to another part of the boat. Finally, he was across the river, and then he boarded one last train to New York, a free state in the North. Anna Murray traveled north to join him, and the couple married and moved to Massachusetts. Worried that slave catchers might still be looking for him, Fredrick decided to change his last name from Bailey to Douglas. Now that he was free, Frederick Douglass wanted to free others. He met many abolitionists. That means people who were working to end slavery. In 1841, he gave his first speech against slavery at an abolitionist meeting. He spoke powerfully about his own experience, and he was asked to speak at many more meetings. Look at all these people clapping for him. 4 years later, he wrote a book about his life. Thousands of people read it, and his words convinced many of them that slavery was morally wrong. Soon after, he started an anti-slavery newspaper called the North Star. By the time the North and South clashed in the Civil War, the conflict that had finally brought an end to slavery in the United States, Frederick Douglass was one of the most famous black men in the country. His difficult journey from enslaved man to free abolitionist had helped change the course of history.
Dude, that is an amazing story.
It is.
Like, I just can't believe I had to keep going back. Like, I was reading over your shoulder and seeing how old he was when these different things happened.
Yeah.
Like, when he...
Oh, yeah.
Like, well, how old is he? He was 16 when he was teaching those other people to read.
Right.
Yeah. And then, what about when he stood up to that Covey guy? Like, that was super risky. Because, like, people... owners were allowed to kill those whom they enslaved.
Right. And
with
there were no consequences.
Like, he could have just, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow. And that was just unbelievably, what a really cool thing. And the different quotes that you have in there from him, what impeccable grammar.
Yeah.
I mean, my gosh. So like, I know. Like, dude, like, nobody, like, that's really good grammar. Like, I always, like, my grammar is terrible. And so, like, I always think, oh my gosh, like, whoa. Like he, like, dude, not only was he like super brave, and because he must have been just like super brilliant too. You know what I mean?
Oh, he had to be.
Like, he had to be like
Yeah.
super brilliant to just like get it all. Like, dude, oh, that was a really cool story.
Yeah, it was. I want to share this little bit because Harriet Tubman doesn't have her own page.
Oh,
or her
okay.
own
So you got
book
some Harriet Tubman
in this,
stuff?
so,
Yeah. Okay.
So here we go. It's just a short little thing.
Okay.
Harriet Tubman was born in Maryland just a couple of years after Frederick Douglass, and she too was enslaved. In her late 20s, Harriet managed to escape using the network known as the Underground Railroad, a loosely organized group of people, free and enslaved, black and white, who helped slaves travel north to free states or to Canada. A year after her escape, Harriet risked returning to Maryland and helped the other family members escape. Over the next decade, that's 10 years,
freaking years, man.
she assisted more than 300 slaves to freedom. But Harriet wanted all enslaved African Americans to be freed. So, when the Civil War began, she supported the Union Army first as a nurse and a cook, and later as a spy. The intelligence she gathered led to a successful raid that freed more than 700 slaves, many of whom joined the Union Army to fight against the South.
That is really cool.
That is cool.
You know,
That's
I was
amazing.
thinking as you were reading that too, and I think Douglas's story definitely talks about the importance of words.
Mm-hmm.
Our use of words has changed over time. And what I like about this book is that it used to be we used to just say, like, Frederick Douglass was a slave, or these
Right.
people were slaves.
Yes.
But now we know that is not the way to put
That's
that.
not
That's
who
not
he
the best
was
way.
or what he was.
Yeah,
Yes.
he was enslaved.
Right.
You know, he wasn't a slave.
Mhm.
And so, and those of us who grew up in a different time, we're learning to change our words to become more like we don't say a homeless person. We say a person experiencing homelessness.
Right,
You know what I mean?
Right.
You know,
It is not what they are.
it's not
or
what
who
they are. Yeah,
Yes.
and Frederick Douglass wasn't a slave. He
Right.
was enslaved by some big weenies. Yes, and that's
to put
the
it
thing.
nicely.
To put it nicely, yes. And I think that's really cool. And the
Yeah.
one thing that I do want to say is, like, when I in 1993, I went to South Africa, okay? And there was a horrible, maybe it was
I didn't know
1995,
that.
95. And it was shortly after apartheid was abolished.
Uh-huh.
However, it was still very much in the horrible
Right.
factors behind it and the horrible beliefs behind it were still very much present. And I stayed with a dear friend who was white and her husband who was African American. And they had children who were of mixed race, you know. And they stayed, he headed up IBM South Africa. And so they stayed in a very, they had a gated community. Now, they could not go out in public without fearing catcalls and horrible things said to them. So that was pretty horrible. And the other thing was they had many people who worked provided by the company, like they had a gardener and they had a housekeeper. And those two people, for example, like lived in, but they were married and never got to hardly ever see their family. So they were probably paid like crap, you know what I mean? Like, and it just makes me think, even in like my lifetime, this stuff, and enslavement goes on in many other different ways,
Right.
you know?
Yes.
And so that's why it's so important to hear these stories and be inspired by people who stood up and people who had courage beyond anything I can ever imagine,
Right.
you know? And so I thank you for what you're doing here, man.
Oh, I'm so pleased that we have this information.
Yeah. Looks
Yeah.
like we have a lot on. Oh my gosh, that book, that one on the top, illustrated by Floyd Cooper, that one by Walter Dean Myers, to the left. That is one of my most favorite authors, is Walter Dean Myers, and Floyd Cooper is a great illustrator.
Mhm.
Dude, these are some
Yeah.
great ones here.
Yeah, so we have books from, the Who Was
Yeah.
and the Step Ups and early readers, and we have an amazing collection of books here. So if you're interested, stop on over.
I'm sure that people have a couple questions. That Who Was Frederick Douglass, though?
Mm-hmm.
His head wasn't really that big, right? Okay, so that was not proportionate, okay?
What do you think?
I don't think it was. And then the other question that I bet is going through all the minds of the students and the children is the Anna Murray that Frederick Douglass married.
Mm-hmm.
That was not the Canadian singer
No.
Anne Murray.
Anne Murray.
Okay, that
Right,
was not,
yeah.
no relation to
Right.
spread your tiny
Right.
wings and fly away.
Many years.
And take the snow back with you where it came from on that day. I do love Anne Murray. But that was not, no relation.
Okay. So, do you know who's next on the list?
Who's next?
Who's next? Susan
B. Anthony. And her name has been misused in a lot of different ways. And so I'm looking forward to finding out about Susan B. Anthony.
Awesome.
All right, we'll see you next time
Thanks for
on
watching and listening.
Kid Actors. And remember, love always wins. Love is winning now.
Love conquers hate.
Love conquers hate. Love conquers discrimination. Love, love, and love. And when you're done loving, guess what? Love some more.
There you go.
Yep. I love you, Miss
Right.
Jan.
Love you too.
Bye.